The radio crackled with static over the mountains of Afghanistan, carrying a voice that would soon become legend. Negative on air rescue, Trident 6. Weather socked in, terrain's too rough. Hold your position and wait for ground extraction. The transmission ended with the cold finality of military protocol, leaving 8 Navy SEALs stranded on a ridgeline with wounded teammates and Taliban forces closing in from 3 sides. What happened next defied every regulation in the Air Force manual. At Bagram Airfield, Captain Raven Ghost Nakamura stood in the operations center, her dark eyes fixed on the weather radar showing the impossible storm system that had grounded every aircraft in theater. Around her, senior officers shook their heads and walked away from the rescue request. The SEALs were on their own. But Ghost had heard something else in that radio transmission, something the brass had missed. Between the static and official military speak, she caught the barely controlled panic of Petty Officer Martinez calling for his wounded team leader. She'd heard that sound before, in the mountains of Iraq 3 years earlier, when her own squadron had been left behind enemy lines with no hope of extraction. The C-130J Super Hercules sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its 4 turboprop engines cold in the pre-dawn darkness. Ghost had logged over 2,000 hours in the aircraft, more than most pilots twice her age, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she was about to commit career suicide. "Ma'am, you can't be serious," Staff Sergeant Torres whispered as Ghost began her pre-flight inspection. "Command already said negative, the weather alone." "Command doesn't know these mountains like I do," Ghost replied, running her hands along the aircraft's aluminum skin. The C-130 was built for impossible missions, designed to land on rough strips that would destroy lesser aircraft. But landing in zero visibility during a storm, on a ridgeline barely long enough for a helicopter, that wasn't just dangerous, it was insane. Ghost's fingers traced the small scar on her left temple, a reminder of the last time she disobeyed orders. That mission had saved 14 Marines but cost her a promotion and the respect of her commanding officer. Some called her reckless. Others whispered she was the best pilot in the Air Force. Tonight, 8 SEALs would discover which reputation was true. She keyed her headset and spoke into the darkness. "Trident 6, this is Ghost Rider. I'm inbound to your position. Clear me a strip and mark it with whatever you've got. I'm coming to get you out." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then, "Ghost Rider, say again your last." "You heard me, Trident 6. Ghost Rider is coming home." 20 minutes later, the C-130's engines roared to life, and Captain Raven Nakamura taxied toward a mission that would either make her a hero or destroy everything she'd worked for. In the mountains ahead, 8 men waited in the darkness, not knowing that salvation wore the call sign of a pilot they'd never heard of. The storm was waiting too. The weatherman had called it a significant meteorological event, which in military speak meant pilots stayed on the ground and prayed for better conditions. Ghost Nakamura had learned long ago that meteorologists were excellent at explaining why missions were impossible after pilots had already completed them. She pushed the C-130's throttles forward and felt the aircraft respond like a living thing. "Ghost Rider Tower, you are not cleared for departure. Return to parking immediately." The tower's voice carried the authority of regulations and common sense. Ghost switched to the emergency frequency without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having. The runway lights blurred past as the C-130 gathered speed, its massive frame surprisingly graceful as it lifted into the storm. Ghost felt the familiar sensation of leaving the safe, predictable world of ground control behind. Up here, there were no committees, no risk assessments, no superior officers explaining why something couldn't be done. There was only physics, skill, and the ancient contract between a pilot and her aircraft. Staff Sergeant Torres gripped his seat as turbulence hammered the plane. He'd flown with Ghost before, through dust storms over Iraq and mountain passes in Afghanistan, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the kind of mission that ended with folded flags and memorial services. "Ma'am, what's our approach plan?" Tors shouted over the engine noise. They both knew there was no approved approach for what Ghost was attempting. Landing a 130,000-pound cargo plane on a mountainside ridgeline in a storm wasn't in any manual. Ghost's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, adjusting for wind shear that would have torn smaller aircraft apart. "We're going to thread the needle, Tors, just like that landing strip in Ramadi, remember?" Tors remembered. They'd taken small arms fire during approach that day, with Ghost maintaining perfect control while bullets punched holes through the cargo compartment. She'd set the C-130 down on a strip barely long enough for a fighter jet, then taken off again with wounded Marines as mortars exploded around them. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Any station, this is Trident 6 requesting immediate casualty evacuation. We have 2 urgent surgical ammunition running low. Taliban forces have our position surrounded." Ghost keyed her microphone. "Trident 6, Ghost Rider, 20 minutes out. What's your strip situation?" Ghost Rider, negative on the strip. "We're on a ridgeline approximately 200 meters of relatively flat ground. No lights, no approach aids. Visibility 0 due to cloud cover." 200 meters. Ghost had landed on longer driveways. The C-130 needed at least 300 meters for a normal landing, more in these conditions. But normal was a word that had lost its meaning the moment she'd started engines without clearance. "Copy, Trident 6, I'll make it work. Pop smoke when you hear my engines." Tors looked at her with something between admiration and terror. "Ma'am, even if we get down, how do we take off again?" Ghost smiled grimly, her face illuminated by the instrument panel's green glow. "One problem at a time, Tors. Right now, 8 men are counting on us to solve the landing part." Below them, the mountains of Afghanistan waited in the darkness like sleeping giants. Ghost had learned to read terrain the way others read books, understanding the language of ridgelines and valleys that could kill or save depending on how well you spoke their dialect. Tonight, she would need every word. The storm embraced the C-130 like a living thing, testing every rivet and wire with winds that changed direction without warning. Ghost fought the controls as updrafts and downdrafts played tug-of-war with the aircraft's massive frame. Flying in these conditions was like trying to thread a needle while riding a mechanical bull. "Ghost Rider, this is Colonel Morrison." The voice on the radio carried the weight of command authority and barely controlled anger. "You are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge." Ghost reached over and switched off the radio. Some orders were easier to apologize for than to obey. Tors watched her with wide eyes, realizing they'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When this mission was over, Ghost would face a court-martial that could end her career and land her in military prison. The GPS showed their position as a small triangle moving through digital mountains, but Ghost trusted her instruments less than the seat of her pants feeling that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. The altimeter spun wildly as pressure changes confused the electronics, but she could feel the aircraft's relationship with the invisible terrain below. "Trident 6, Ghost Rider, 5 minutes out. Talk to me about your tactical situation." The SEAL team leader's voice was steady despite the circumstances. "Ghost Rider, we've got Taliban positions on 3 sides, approximately company strength. They've been probing our perimeter for the past hour. My team medic says we need to get Rodriguez and Washington to a trauma center within the hour or we're going to lose them." Ghost absorbed the information while fighting a wind gust that tried to flip the C-130 inverted. 2 critically wounded SEALs, enemy forces closing in, and a landing zone that existed only in theory. Just another day at the office. "Copy, Trident 6. When you hear my engines, I need every man who can move to form a human runway. Use flashlights, strobe lights, anything you've got. I need to see exactly 200 meters of flat ground. Roger, Ghost Rider. Be advised we're taking sporadic sniper fire. Landing zone may be hot. Torres caught Ghost's eye and shook his head. Landing under fire was beyond dangerous. It was suicidal. But Ghost had already made her decision back at Bagram when she'd heard the desperation in Martinez's voice. Some lines couldn't be uncrossed, and some debts had to be paid regardless of the cost. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a cathedral, invisible but felt in the way the aircraft responded to air currents and pressure changes. Ghost had learned to fly by feel as much as sight, trusting instincts honed by thousands of hours in impossible conditions. Tonight, those instincts were all that stood between 8 SEALs and eternity. There, Torres pointed through the windscreen at a brief break in the clouds. For just a moment, they could see lights, tiny pinpricks arranged in a rough rectangle on a ridgeline that looked barely wide enough for a bicycle. Ghost began her descent into the unknown, carrying the prayers of 8 men she'd never met and the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. The storm closed around them again, swallowing the lights and leaving only darkness, courage, and the steady thunder of 4 turboprop engines cutting through the night. Below them, the SEALs waited with their wounded and their fatting hope, not knowing that salvation was 2 minutes away. The clouds parted like curtains revealing a stage, and for exactly 7 seconds, Ghost could see everything. The ridgeline stretched ahead like a narrow scar across the mountainside, marked by the trembling beams of SEAL flashlights. At 150 knots and descending, she had one chance to thread the C-130 between the peaks and onto a strip of ground that looked smaller than her hometown airport's taxiway. Jesus Christ, Torres whispered, seeing what they were attempting for the first time. The landing zone wasn't just short, it was practically vertical, sloping down toward a cliff that dropped into darkness. 1 degree too steep on approach and they'd slam into the mountainside. 1 degree too shallow and they'd overshoot into the valley beyond. Ghost's hands moved with surgical precision, adjusting flaps and power settings while compensating for crosswinds that wanted to push them into the rocks. The C-130 groaned as she forced it through maneuvers it was never designed to perform, but the aircraft responded like it understood the stakes. 4 engines, 130,000 pounds, and the lives of 8 SEALs balanced on the edge of physics and faith. Ghost Rider, Trident 6, we can hear you but can't see you. Estimate your position. 30 seconds out, Trident 6. Clear the zone and keep those lights steady. Ghost's voice remained calm despite the controlled violence of the approach. She'd learned long ago that panic was contagious, and right now 8 men needed to believe that landing a cargo plane on a mountainside in a storm was just another day at work. The ridgeline appeared again, closer this time, and Ghost could see the SEALs spread along its edges like human runway lights. They'd done exactly what she'd asked, marking the boundaries of their impossible landing strip with disciplined precision. These were men who understood that when the plan was insane, execution had to be perfect. Torres gripped his seat as Ghost chopped power and pulled the nose up, bleeding off airspeed while fighting to keep the aircraft aligned with the narrow strip of flat ground. Too fast and they'd overshoot. Too slow and they'd stall and fall like a stone. The margin for error had disappeared entirely. The first impact felt like controlled demolition. The C-130's main landing gear struck the rocky ground with a violence that would have collapsed lesser aircraft, but the Hercules was built for rough field operations. Ghost stood on the brakes, while reverse thrust from the propellers tried to tear the engines from their mounts. Rocks and debris pelted the fuselage as the aircraft fought to stop before reaching the cliff that waited at the far end of the strip. Come on, Ghost muttered, feeling the plane's momentum carrying them toward the edge of forever. The distance markers the SEALs had established flashed past, 150 meters, 175, 190. At 195 meters, with 5 meters of ridgeline remaining, the C-130 finally surrendered to physics and ground to a halt. For a moment, the only sound was the tick of cooling engines and the whistle of wind through bullet holes they hadn't noticed during the approach. Then Torres began laughing, the kind of laughter that follows impossible survival. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaky with adrenaline, "remind me never to doubt you again." Ghost was already unbuckling her harness, her mind shifting from pilot to battlefield commander. They were on the ground, but the mission was only half complete. 8 SEALs needed medical evacuation, enemy forces were closing in, and somehow she had to get this aircraft airborne again from a strip that barely existed. Outside, she could hear voices shouting coordinates and medical status reports. The easy part was over. The cargo ramp dropped with hydraulic precision, revealing a tableau of controlled chaos. 6 Navy SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, carrying 2 stretchers toward the aircraft while maintaining defensive positions. Ghost counted muzzle flashes in the darkness beyond the ridgeline, at least a dozen Taliban fighters testing the perimeter, probing for weakness. "Ma'am, they're bringing them up now," Torres called from the cargo bay. The wounded SEALs looked younger than Ghost remembered being at their age, their faces pale against the olive drab stretchers. Rodriguez had taken shrapnel through his left leg and abdomen. Washington's right arm hung at an unnatural angle, and blood seeped through field dressings that couldn't quite stop the bleeding. Petty Officer Martinez, the team medic whose voice Ghost had heard in the original distress call, looked up as they loaded the stretchers. "You're the pilot." His tone carried surprise, not at her gender but at her decision to attempt the impossible. "I'm the pilot," Ghost confirmed, helping secure the stretcher tie-downs. "How long do they have?" "Rodriguez needs surgery within the hour. Washington can wait, but not long." Martinez's hands never stopped moving as he adjusted IV bags and checked vital signs. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are or why you came, but—" "Save it for later, Doc. We're not out of this yet." Ghost moved forward to the cockpit, her mind already calculating takeoff parameters. The ridgeline sloped downward toward the cliff, which would help them gain airspeed, but they were also 8,000 feet above sea level, where thin air robbed engines of power. The SEAL team leader, Chief Petty Officer Kowalski, appeared at her elbow. "Ghost Rider, we've got movement on all sides. Taliban are massing for an assault, probably thinking we're stuck here." "How long do we have?" Ghost was already running through her pre-flight checklist, testing control surfaces and engine parameters. "Maybe 10 minutes before they're close enough to put accurate fire on the aircraft." Ghost nodded, her fingers flying over switches and dials. The C-130 had been designed for short takeoff performance, but not from a 200-meter strip at altitude with a full load. Physics suggested they were about to become a very expensive bonfire. "Chief, I need your remaining team spread along the takeoff path. When I start engines, anything that moves in the next 300 meters gets shot. We're going to need every foot of ground we can get." Kowalski understood immediately. "Roger that, we'll clear you a path." Torres appeared at Ghost's shoulder, his face grim. "Ma'am, I ran the numbers. Even with the downward slope, we're going to need at least 250 meters to clear the valley. We've got maybe 200 on flat ground, then it's cliff." Ghost studied the terrain through night vision goggles, seeing the challenge with mathematical clarity. Traditional takeoff procedures required more runway than they possessed, but traditional procedures assumed pilots weren't willing to bet everything on the margin between physics and faith. "Torres, remember that combat takeoff we did from Fob Chapman, the one where we went airborne before we had flying speed?" Torres remembered. They'd used ground effect and pure momentum to become airborne, then gained speed in a controlled dive before pulling out over the valley. It was a technique that worked exactly once, until it didn't. "Yes, ma'am, but that was with a longer strip and no mountains." Ghost smiled grimly and began starting engines. "Tonight, we get to find out if the books are right about what's impossible." Outside, the SEALs took their positions as 4 turboprop engines roared to life. In the distance, muzzle flashes grew brighter as Taliban fighters realized their quarry was about to escape. The engines spooled up to full power, their combined thunder echoing off the mountainsides like the voice of an angry god. Ghost held the brakes as the C-130 strained against its constraints, every rivet and bolt tested by forces that wanted to tear the aircraft apart. Through her headset, she could hear the SEALs coordinating fields of fire, their voices calm despite the approaching enemy. Trident 6 Ghost Rider, beginning takeoff roll in 30 seconds. Keep that path clear. Roger. Ghost Rider will handle our end. Ghost released the brakes and felt 130,000 pounds of aircraft lunge forward like a caged animal suddenly freed. The C-130 accelerated down the narrow strip, its landing gear pounding over rocks and debris that would have destroyed a civilian airliner. Through the windscreen, Ghost could see tracer rounds beginning to arc across their path as Taliban fighters closed the distance. 50 knots, Tors called out, reading the airspeed indicator as they consumed precious runway. At their current acceleration rate, they'd reach the cliff edge before achieving flying speed. Ghost held the controls steady, waiting for the moment when physics and desperation would meet. 70 knots. Contact left, contact left. Tor's voice rose as AK-47 fire sparked off the aircraft's aluminum skin. One of the SEALs returned fire from the cargo ramp, his M4 rifle adding its voice to the mechanical symphony of their escape. Ghost felt the C-130 wanting to fly, the wings generating lift that tried to pull them skyward. But not enough. Not yet. The cliff edge rushed toward them with mathematical inevitability, and she could see the valley yawning beyond like an open grave. 90 knots. Ma'am, we're running out of ground. At 100 knots, with 20 meters of ridgeline remaining, Ghost pulled back on the yoke and prayed to whatever gods protected fools and aviators. The C-130 left the earth with a shudder that seemed to shake the mountains themselves, wallowing through the air with barely enough speed to maintain flight. For 3 heartbeats, they hung suspended between earth and sky, the valley floor 2,000 feet below reaching up like hungry fingers. Ghost pushed the yoke forward, trading altitude for airspeed in a controlled dive that would either save them or kill them faster. Ghost Rider, you are airborne. Chief Kowalski's voice carried relief and admiration in equal measure. Clear of the landing zone. The aircraft gained speed in its dive toward the valley floor, engines howling as Ghost pulled out of the descent with G-forces that pressed everyone against their seats. Behind them, the ridgeline erupted in muzzle flashes as frustrated Taliban fighters emptied their magazines at a target already beyond reach. Tors watched the altimeter wind up as they climbed toward cruising altitude. Ma'am, how did you know that would work? Ghost leveled off at 15,000 feet, the C-130 steady and strong beneath her hands. I didn't, but sometimes you have to trust the aircraft to do things the manual says are impossible. In the cargo compartment, Petty Officer Martinez continued working on his wounded teammates, while the remaining SEALs stared out the windows at mountains that had almost become their tomb. They were alive because a pilot they'd never heard of had decided that orders were suggestions and physics were merely strong recommendations. Ghost Rider, Bagram Tower. You are cleared for emergency landing, runway 3. Medical personnel are standing by. Ghost keyed her microphone for the last time that night. Bagram Tower, Ghost Rider inbound with precious cargo. Request priority handling for 2 urgent surgical patients. 20 minutes later, the C-130 touched down at Bagram with the gentle precision of a routine training flight. As the wounded SEALs were rushed to the trauma center, Ghost shut down engines and sat quietly in the cockpit, knowing her career was probably over but not regretting a single decision. The debriefing room at Bagram Airfield felt like a courtroom, complete with a long table of stern-faced officers whose expression suggested Ghost was about to face a military execution by bureaucracy. Colonel Morrison sat at the center, his jaw set in the particular way that meant someone's career was about to become a cautionary tale. Ghost entered wearing a fresh flight suit, her bearing military straight despite having slept exactly 90 minutes since landing. Behind her sat Chief Petty Officer Kowalski and the 5 uninjured SEALs from Trident 6, their presence requested as witnesses to what the investigating board was calling an unauthorized rescue mission conducted in violation of standing orders and flight safety protocols. Captain Nakamura, Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of military justice, you are accused of willful disobedience of direct orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and reckless endangerment of personnel and equipment. How do you respond to these charges? Ghost had prepared for this moment during the sleepless hours after the mission. She'd weighed every word, considered every possible defense, and ultimately decided that honesty was the only option that wouldn't dishonor the men she'd risked everything to save. Sir, I violated standing orders because 8 American servicemen needed immediate evacuation, and no authorized rescue was available. I used military aircraft for its intended purpose, saving American lives. As for reckless endangerment, the only personnel in danger were volunteers who understood the risks. Colonel Morrison's expression didn't change. Captain, whether conditions made that mission impossible according to every qualified meteorologist and safety officer, you could have killed everyone aboard that aircraft. Yes, sir, but we didn't die. 8 SEALs came home instead of spending the night fighting for their lives on a mountainside. Ghost's voice remained steady, professional, even as she felt her career crumbling around her. Chief Kowalski cleared his throat. Sir, permission to address the board. Morrison nodded reluctantly. Military protocol required him to hear testimony from all involved parties, even when the outcome seemed predetermined. Kowalski stood with the bearing of a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything the Navy could offer. Gentlemen, I've been a SEAL for 15 years. I've worked with pilots from every service, in every combat zone where Americans have fought. What Captain Nakamura did last night wasn't reckless. It was the finest example of military airmanship I've ever witnessed. The board members exchanged glances. They'd expected the SEALs to support Ghost, but Kowalski's tone carried a conviction that was hard to dismiss. She didn't just save our lives, Kowalski continued. She saved the lives of 2 wounded warriors who would have died on that mountain. Rodriguez and Washington are alive this morning because one pilot decided that orders serve people, not the other way around. Major Stevens, the board's senior aviator, leaned forward. Chief, no one questions Captain Nakamura's courage or intentions, but military discipline exists for reasons. If every pilot decides which orders to follow, we have chaos instead of a military. Ghost found her voice. Sir, with respect, military discipline also includes the obligation to preserve American lives when possible. I weighed the risks against the certain consequences of inaction and made the decision I could live with. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft operations. Ghost knew her fate was being decided by men who'd never faced the choice between certain court-martial and possible catastrophe. She'd made her peace with the consequences, but the weight of judgment still pressed against her chest like a physical thing. Colonel Morrison gathered the papers before him with the finality of a man about to end a career. The silence stretched like a taut wire until it was broken by an unexpected voice from the back of the room. Gentlemen, I think there's something you should know about Captain Nakamura's record. Everyone turned to see Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, commander of Air Mobility Operations, who had entered the room so quietly that no one had noticed. Her presence changed the atmosphere instantly. General officers didn't attend routine disciplinary hearings unless something significant was happening. Colonel Morrison stood immediately. "General Hayes, we weren't expecting." "At ease, Colonel. I came as soon as I heard about last night's mission." General Hayes moved to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years making decisions that other people questioned. "Before you pass judgment on Captain Nakamura, I want to share some information that isn't in her personnel file." Ghost felt her stomach drop. Whatever was coming, it couldn't be good. General Hayes opened a classified folder and began reading. 3 years ago, in Iraq, Captain Nakamura's C-130 was shot down behind enemy lines during a routine supply mission. She kept the aircraft airborne long enough to reach a forward operating base, crash-landed with minimal casualties, then organized the defense of the crash site until rescue arrived 18 hours later. The board members leaned forward, suddenly interested. Ghost had never talked about Iraq, never sought recognition for a mission that had nearly ended her career the first time. The official report credited her with saving 14 Marines and 3 aircrew, General Hayes continued. But what the report didn't mention was that she was flying with a dislocated shoulder and a concussion from the surface-to-air missile that hit her aircraft. She kept flying, kept fighting, and kept her people alive when anyone else would have given up. Chief Kowalski looked at Ghost with new understanding. The pilot who'd saved his team wasn't just skilled, she was proven under the worst possible conditions. General Hayes closed the folder and addressed the board directly. "Gentlemen, we can discuss regulations and proper procedures all day. But at some point, we have to acknowledge that exceptional situations require exceptional people making exceptional decisions. Captain Nakamura didn't break the rules for personal glory or convenience. She broke them because 8 Americans needed help, and she was the only person positioned to provide it." Colonel Morrison's expression had shifted from prosecutor to something approaching uncertainty. "General, nobody questions the captain's courage or competence, but if we don't enforce discipline, we'll lose good people to bureaucratic paralysis," General Hayes interrupted. "Colonel, how many pilots in your command would have attempted that mission?" Morrison considered the question honestly. "None, ma'am. The weather conditions alone." "Exactly. Which means that without Captain Nakamura's decision to violate orders, we'd be planning funeral services instead of disciplinary hearings." General Hayes turned to face Ghost directly. "Captain, your actions last night demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and moral courage the Air Force needs." Ghost felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She'd prepared for court-martial, demotion, and possible imprisonment. She hadn't prepared for praise from a general officer. "However," General Hayes continued, her tone becoming more formal, "you did violate direct orders and put valuable equipment at risk. There have to be consequences for that, regardless of the outcome." The hammer was about to fall. Ghost straightened her shoulders and prepared to accept whatever punishment military justice required. She'd saved 8 lives, and that would have to be enough. General Hayes walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where C-130s sat like sleeping giants waiting for their next mission. Her silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand that whatever came next would define not just Ghost's career, but how the Air Force responded to pilots who chose conscience over compliance. "Captain Nakamura," the general said without turning around, "effective immediately, you're being reassigned to the 347th Special Operations Squadron. Your new position will be instructor pilot for high-risk extraction missions." Ghost blinked, certain she'd misheard. Around the room, board members exchanged confused glances. Reassignment to special operations was typically a reward, not a punishment. General Hayes turned back to face the room. "The Pentagon has decided that pilots capable of successful missions under impossible conditions are too valuable to waste on disciplinary proceedings. Captain Nakamura will spend the next year teaching other pilots how to accomplish what they think can't be done." Colonel Morrison found his voice first. "General, what about the violations, the breach of protocol?" "Already handled. The mission has been reclassified as a combat search and rescue operation conducted under emergency authority. Captain Nakamura's actions are now officially commended rather than condemned." General Hayes smiled slightly. "Sometimes the paperwork catches up to reality instead of the other way around." Chief Kowalski grinned broadly. The Navy SEAL understood military politics well enough to recognize a bureaucratic miracle when he saw one. Somewhere above their pay grades, people with stars on their shoulders had decided that results mattered more than regulations. Ghost remained standing at attention, still processing the reversal of fortune. "Ma'am, I appreciate the confidence, but I should point out that I did violate direct orders. The precedent." "The precedent," General Hayes interrupted, "is that the United States military values leaders who make hard decisions under pressure. Your new assignment comes with explicit authority to conduct rescue missions when lives are at stake, regardless of conventional wisdom or weather reports." The general moved closer, her voice dropping to a level that carried the weight of personal experience. "Captain, 25 years ago, I was a lieutenant who violated orders to extract wounded soldiers from Cambodia. My commanding officer wanted to court-martial me. Instead, a wise general officer decided the Air Force needed more pilots willing to risk their careers for their people." The connection became clear. General Hayes hadn't just appeared randomly at Ghost's disciplinary hearing. She'd come because she recognized something of herself in the pilot who'd chosen conscience over compliance. "Your call sign isn't just Ghost because of your ability to appear where others can't," the general continued. "It's because you have the ability to accomplish missions that exist only in theory until someone like you proves they're possible." Torres, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, does this mean we're not in trouble for going along with the mission?" General Hayes laughed, a sound that seemed to release the tension that had filled the room like compressed air. "Staff Sergeant, you followed your pilot into an impossible situation and helped bring 8 Americans home safely. The Air Force needs more sergeants with your judgment." The disciplinary board began gathering their papers with the peculiar mixture of relief and bewilderment that comes when expecting to end a career, but instead witnessing its transformation. Ghost remained at attention, still not entirely convinced this wasn't an elaborate dream. "Captain," General Hayes said, her tone becoming official again, "you report to Hurlburt Field in 72 hours. Your first class of students is already selected, 12 pilots who think they know what's impossible. Your job is to teach them otherwise." The transport flight to Hurlburt Field gave Ghost 36 hours to process her transformation from potential court-martial defendant to special operations instructor. She stared out the window at landscape that seemed impossibly green and peaceful after the stark mountains of Afghanistan, wondering if she'd somehow dreamed the entire sequence of events. Staff Sergeant Torres sat across from her, reading the mission briefing for their new assignment. "Ma'am, according to this, we'll be training pilots for combat search and rescue in denied territory, basically teaching them to do what we did last week, but as official doctrine instead of career-ending insanity." Ghost accepted the briefing packet and found herself looking at her own mission photographs, satellite images of the ridgeline where she'd landed the C-130, technical analysis of approach angles that should have been impossible, and meteorological data that confirmed what everyone already knew. The mission shouldn't have worked. But it had worked, and now the Air Force wanted to understand how. The briefing included profiles of her 12 prospective students, all experienced pilots selected for advanced rescue training. Captain Mitchell "Reaper" Jackson, who'd flown A-10s over Iraq until an IED took out his forward operating base. Major Sarah Chen, a C-17 pilot with over 3,000 hours in strategic airlift. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Washington, a helicopter pilot transitioning to fixed-wing after 2 tours in special operations. All experienced, all competent, all about to learn that experience and competence weren't enough when physics and desperation collided. "Tours, what do you think they expect us to teach them?" Ghost asked, genuinely curious about how the Air Force planned to codify what had essentially been educated madness. Tours considered the question while watching farmland pass beneath them. "Ma'am, I think they want us to teach them that the manual is a starting point, not a destination. Most pilots learn to fly within parameters. You fly in spite of parameters." The observation was more insightful than Ghost had expected from her crew chief. Tours had been with her for 3 years, had watched her push aircraft beyond their design limitations, and had never once suggested that caution might be preferable to results. "The thing is," Tours continued, "what you did wasn't just about breaking rules. It was about understanding which rules could be broken and which ones would kill us. That's not something you learn from a textbook." Ghost nodded, beginning to understand the magnitude of her new responsibility. She'd been asked to teach the unteachable, to transform theoretical impossibility into operational capability. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was psychological. She had to convince experienced pilots that their understanding of limitations was incomplete. The flight crew announced their descent into Hurlburt Field, and Ghost looked down at the home of Air Force Special Operations Command. Below her, she could see the flight line packed with aircraft that existed to perform missions other people considered impossible. CV-22 Ospreys, AC-130 gunships, and MC-130 variants designed for infiltration and extraction in hostile territory. Somewhere,